This is a story of how a scrappy, independent magazine kept skateboarding alive during the years the industry nearly died, and in doing so became the single most influential publication the sport has ever produced. By the early 1980s, skateboarding was in serious trouble. The vert ramps and skate parks that had defined the previous decade were closing at an alarming rate, crushed by soaring insurance premiums after a wave of injury lawsuits. Sponsorship money dried up. Major skate brands scaled back or folded entirely. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like skateboarding's moment had passed, a fad from the 1970s that had simply run its course. Into this collapsing landscape, in 1981, two skateboarders and business partners, Fausto Vitello and Eric Swisher, launched a small magazine called Thrasher. It wasn't polished, it wasn't corporate. It looked and read like it had been put together by people who actually skated because it had been. In an industry that was hemorrhaging money and abandoning riders, Thrasher's timing turned out to be less of a gamble and more of a lifeline. What set Thrasher apart from the beginning wasn't just its content, it was its attitude. Where earlier skate publications had leaned toward glossy, advertiser-friendly presentation, Thrasher embraced a raw, aggressive, almost confrontational aesthetic that mirrored the punk rock scene skating was increasingly tangled up with. The photography was gritty, the writing was blunt, sometimes brutal, never sanitized for a mainstream audience. Thrasher didn't try to make skateboarding look safe or respectable. It leaned directly into the danger and rebellion that defined the culture. And that honesty is exactly what built trust with its readers. This mattered enormously during a period when skateboarding had nowhere else to turn for real coverage. Mainstream media largely ignored the sport, and what little attention it did get often framed skaters as a public nuisance or a legal liability. Thrasher was written by skaters, for skaters, with zero interest in making the sport palatable to outsiders. For a generation of riders who felt abandoned by an industry in freefall, that authenticity became something to hold on to. As skate parks closed across the country, skaters became increasingly isolated from each other, scattered into small, disconnected local scenes with no easy way to know what was happening elsewhere. Thrasher filled that gap. Every issue worked as a lifeline connecting far-flung pockets of skate culture, showing readers in Ohio or Florida or wherever else that skating was still alive and evolving in California, and that the sport hadn't actually died just because their local park had closed. This connective function turned out to be one of Thrasher's most important, if underappreciated, contributions to skateboarding's survival. Without a shared reference point, it's entirely possible the sports culture could have fractured into disconnected regional scenes with no common identity. Thrasher gave skaters everywhere the same language, the same heroes, the same sense that they belonged to something larger than their own neighborhood. Thrasher's timing also happened to line up with one of the most consequential shifts in skateboarding history: the rise of street skating. As vert ramps disappeared, skaters increasingly turned to curbs, stairs, and handrails, and this transition needed documentation and validation just as much as it needed pioneers like Rodney Mullen inventing the tricks. Thrasher covered street skating with the same seriousness it gave vert, treating the emerging discipline as legitimate skateboarding rather than a lesser makeshift substitute. This coverage did more than just document a trend. It helped legitimize street skating as skateboarding's future at a moment when the industry could easily have written the discipline off. Riders who were inventing tricks in empty parking lots with no formal recognition suddenly had a platform that took their work seriously, and that recognition helped speed up street skating's rise from underground necessity to the sport's dominant discipline. Beyond photography and trick coverage, Thrasher shaped the actual vocabulary and attitude of skate culture itself. Its writing style, irreverent, aggressive, deliberately unpolished, became a template that other skate media would follow for decades. Slang that first appeared in Thrasher's pages spread through the sport nationally, carried by a readership that had no other consistent source for what was happening in skateboarding. The magazine's aesthetic also became inseparable from skating's broader relationship with punk rock. Thrasher covered bands alongside skaters, treated the two scenes as culturally overlapping rather than separate, and in doing so helped cement an association between skateboarding and punk that persists in the culture to this day. For many skaters coming up in the 1980s, Thrasher wasn't just where you learned about tricks, it was where you learned what skate culture was supposed to sound like and look like. What makes Thrasher's story particularly notable is its longevity relative to nearly everything else from skateboarding's difficult 1980s. Skate companies that seemed dominant during that decade folded, restructured, or disappeared entirely as the industry shrank. Thrasher, despite operating on a fraction of the resources available to bigger commercial players, kept publishing consistently, adapting its coverage as skateboarding itself evolved from vert-dominated to street-dominated, from a struggling niche activity to a booming global industry. That consistency turned Thrasher into something more than just a magazine. It became an institutional memory for skate culture, one of the only threads connecting skateboarding's near collapse in the early 1980s to its explosive mainstream growth decades later. Nearly every major skater, brand, and cultural shift in skateboarding's modern history passed through Thrasher's pages at some point, making its archive an unintentional but comprehensive record of the sport's entire evolution. Thrasher didn't invent skateboarding, and it wasn't the only publication covering the sport during its darkest commercial years. But it did something that turned out to matter more than any single article or photograph. It refused to let the culture disappear when the industry around it was collapsing. By staying raw, staying connected to actual skaters, and refusing to soften itself for an audience that didn't exist yet, Thrasher gave a scattered, struggling sport a shared identity to hold on to until the rest of the world caught up. That's not just magazine history, that's survival.